Intensifying immigration debate. The Supreme Court considers a case affecting millions of people. Reaching out to refugees. What Pope Francis is saying about his weekend trip to a migrant camp in Greece. Search for survivors. Earthquakes leave victims buried in rubble. And support for the Little Sisters of the Poor. How Americans view the fight over religious freedom. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, April 18th, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. A divided Supreme Court hears a case challenging President Obama's executive actions on immigration. This case impacts millions of people living in the U.S. illegally. Justices heard oral arguments today. Wyatt Goolsby reports from the High Court tonight. Wyatt?
Brian, the court appears split between the liberal-leaning and the conservative-leaning justices. Usually oral arguments here at the Supreme Court last about an hour, but today Chief Justice John Roberts extended that to 90 minutes, an indication the High Court sees this as a major case.
The president's plan to overhaul the immigration system lies in the hands of the Supreme Court. Texas is leading 26 states dominated by Republicans in challenging that plan. They say President Obama overstepped his authority with his executive order in 2014, shielding more than 4 million undocumented immigrants from deportation and giving them work permits.
I am an American citizen.
It applies to parents whose children are citizens or are living in the country legally. The state of Texas argues Obama doesn't have the power to change immigration law.
If we allow a president, whether it's this president or a future president, no matter what their political persuasion or their party, to make changes in the law without congressional approval, then we will end up with a perverted constitution.
On the other side, the Obama administration and a number of Democrats say the executive action is well within the president's right. They say the law is not amnesty.
We know we need immigration reform, and we will keep fighting for that. But we've also known all along that there were things the president could do under existing law to protect families and young people from deportation and despair.
The case comes in the middle of a presidential campaign marked by a lot of debate over immigration.
It's possible that if the court continues to be split, this could end in a 4-4 tie. If that happens, then Obama's plan would be left in limbo. Lower courts have already sided with Texas and other states on their case. A decision is not expected until June. Brian?
Wyatt Goolsby at the Supreme Court, thank you. And demonstrators from across the nation converged on the Supreme Court today. Catherine Szeltner reports police blocked traffic to make room for them.
Undocumented, unafraid. Undocumented, unafraid.
The debate over crossing the border crossed language barriers outside the Supreme Court today. A group of President Obama opponents outside the High Court say they simply want immigrants to follow U.S. laws.
They are to come here legally. If they're not here legally, go home, get your papers, and come back again.
I think it would go a long way if they would show that they respect the process in this country.
Today's rally is overflowing from the Supreme Court steps and onto the street. Most people here are in support of President Obama's actions. Their message seems to be the same. They want to see families stay together.
The Ramirez family came to the U.S. from Mexico 10 years ago.
We need to stay together with all my kids and I grow together.
We like to feel secure with our kids growing up here and knowing that we can stay with them.
The church teaches the government has two main duties on immigration: welcome the foreigner and secure one's border for the common good. A group of Franciscan friars joined the hundreds of demonstrators today. They work directly with immigrant families.
We want justice for these people, and not just rules to be followed, but real true justice. That's what the gospel asked us to be about, and that's what we're going to be about.
Between the music and dancing, today's rally sometimes felt more like a party than protest. But for supporters here, the Supreme Court arguments focus on the most important topic.
Even though it's an executive order, well, millions of people here in the United States would benefit from that.
Catherine Szeltner, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. We have continuing coverage of this immigration debate. Attorney Amy Howe joins us a little later with analysis. Meanwhile, other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. The U.S. plans to send 200 more troops to Iraq, along with Apache attack helicopters. Defense Secretary Ash Carter made the announcement today in Iraq. Iraqi troops are trying to retake Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, from ISIS fighters. Special forces reportedly killed an ISIS leader who supervised that area. A bus explodes in Jerusalem today, wounding at least 21 people. Police call this a terror attack. The blast raises fears of a return to the Palestinian suicide bombings that ravaged Israeli cities a decade ago. Police say it is too early to know the identity of the attacker or if it was indeed a suicide bombing. Tensions between Russia and the U.S. rise over a military encounter in the Baltic Sea. Chief White House correspondent Lauren Ashburn says the Obama administration is downplaying the issue.
Brian, the latest incident happened on Thursday when a Russian fighter jet came within 30 feet of a U.S. Air Force reconnaissance plane. Yet when the president and Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke by phone today, this incident and another involving a U.S. warship never came up. This video from Tuesday shows a Russian jet buzzing the USS Cook. It came within 50 feet and took several passes. No one was hurt. A Russian chopper came close enough to be able to take photographs of the Navy ship. The incident had Secretary of State John Kerry fuming.
Under the rules of engagement, that could have been a shoot down. So people need to understand that this is serious business, and the United States is not going to be intimidated.
The White House today appeared to downplay the incidents.
These kinds of incidents, while provocative and concerning, are not particularly unusual.
Russian officials say neither of the jets were armed, and they say the flybys were in accordance with international rules. The U.S. says the USS Cook was operating in international waters, about 70 miles from Russian military ports. And the U.S. says the reconnaissance plane never entered Russian territory. The last two close encounters between Russian military aircraft and U.S. warships took place in June and October of last year. Brian?
Thank you, Lauren Ashburn at the White House tonight. Pope Francis offers prayers for the victims of earthquakes in Japan and Ecuador. A series of devastating quakes leveled buildings and caused widespread death and devastation in both countries. Ecuador reports 350 deaths and many more injuries. A religious sister and 5 postulants of the Servant Sisters of the Home of the Mother are reportedly among those dead. Saturday's 7.8 magnitude earthquake has been followed by hundreds of aftershocks. They're making the search and recovery effort even more difficult. Catholic Relief Services says water, food, and emergency shelter are the immediate needs. There are occasional glimmers of hope. A 7-year-old girl is rescued from the rubble, and her mother was also found alive in a city on Ecuador's Pacific coast. One of the earthquakes in Japan triggered a huge landslide. Rescue workers using heavy equipment are searching for victims trapped underground. The earthquakes killed more than 40 people and forced 180,000 to evacuate to shelters. Japan is also bracing for more aftershocks. The Vatican says the Holy See and a Catholic charity will support 3 Syrian families. Mary Shovlain says Pope Francis brought them to Rome from the Greek island of Lesbos, where he visited this weekend.
In an emotional visit to the Greek island of Lesbos Saturday, Pope Francis met with dozens of migrants and refugees who fled the Middle East and North Africa. Many of the refugees lined the detention camp just to get a glimpse of the Pope. Some asked for blessings.
Father, please bless me. Please, Father, bless me.
This refugee overcome by emotion as he knelt at the Holy Father's feet. According to the Vatican, Pope Francis wanted to show solidarity towards the refugees. And before wrapping up the 5-hour visit, the Pope took 3 migrant families from Syria back to the Vatican with him. The Pope acknowledged the sacrifice of all the migrants and told them, "You are not alone."
Vorrei dirvi che non siete soli.
The Pope's visit comes nearly 1 month after the European Union and Turkey deal went into effect. Under this new controversial policy, for every Syrian refugee returned to Turkey from Greece, a Syrian refugee in Turkey is resettled in the EU.
I believe, and this is my best priority, to deliver this deal on the framework of the international legislation. So that's why our obligation is to examine ad hoc all the asylum demands.
On his way back to Rome, Francis showed reporters the drawings children in the camps gave him.
Cosa vogliono I bambini? Pace.
What do they want? Peace, he said. Francis says it took planning and paperwork by the governments of the Vatican, Italy, and Greece to relocate the families. A Catholic group here in Rome will help care for them and find them work. It remains to be seen if lawmakers in the European Union will pay attention to the Pope's appeals. In Rome, Mary Shovlain, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mary. And one of the refugees who returned with the Pope says it was difficult for a mother in the midst of the Syrian civil war. Naur Essa says she wants to raise her 2-year-old son in a peaceful environment. She says meeting the Pope was overwhelming. On her first day in Rome, she registered for school and attended Italian lessons. Back to our top story. The Supreme Court takes up the challenge to the president's immigration executive action. Amy Howe, editor of SCOTUSblog, served as counsel in more than 24 merits cases at the Supreme Court, also argued 2 cases there. Amy, you were in the court today. What arguments seemed to gain traction with them?
There were a couple of arguments. One was the idea that Texas and the other states challenging the program don't even have the right to be in court at all. There's a legal doctrine known as standing, and Texas says because it's going to have to spend money to give driver's licenses to these new groups of undocumented immigrants, it's injured and therefore has standing. But Justices Stephen Breyer and Sonia Sotomayor in particular seem skeptical of that argument. The other argument that seemed to get some traction with the court's more conservative justices was the idea that the Obama administration is exceeding its authority because it's sort of granting a whole class of undocumented immigrants a new status, that they'd be lawfully present in the country and then have access to all kinds of benefits, including the right to work and perhaps Social Security.
With only 8 justices seem to be split ideologically, what happens if there's a tie vote?
If there's a tie vote, in baseball the tie goes to the runner, in the Supreme Court the tie goes to whoever won in the lower court. And in this case that's Texas and the other states. So that would be almost as bad news for the Obama administration as a ruling against it, because the lower court has blocked the policy from going into effect. And so that would mean that sort of indefinitely the policy couldn't go into effect.
And this is a presidential election year. What impact on the race?
If the court were to rule one way or the other, I think that would certainly galvanize the other side. If the court were to rule for the Obama administration, that would galvanize supporters of Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have said that if they were the president, they would continue a similar policy. And it just also sort of brings home the significance of this empty seat on the Supreme Court that the next president could have the opportunity to fill.
Amy Howe with SCOTUSblog. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, another key political test, what the candidates are saying on the eve of the New York primary. And the plight of refugees, the Pope's trip to Greece calls attention to the crisis. You got to see this rescue caught on camera in the middle of intense flooding in Houston. TV reporter Steve Campion helped pull a man to safety as his car began sinking. The driver looked back in shock as his car slipped under the water. Some parts of Texas have been hit with more than a foot of rain, flooding entire neighborhoods. Thank you for joining us on this Monday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Winners of New York's presidential primary tomorrow will likely see a big boost in their delegates. Donald Trump leads in the Republican polls.
We love this city. You look at the other folks that are running, they couldn't care less about New York.
The nation is looking to Maryland to decide, do we nominate Donald Trump and hand the election to Hillary Clinton?
Ted Cruz, trailing in New York, is already campaigning in Maryland. Even though he leads in delegates, Trump continues to call the Republican convention rigged. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton make one last push for New York's Democratic votes. Sanders, who spent Friday at the Vatican, tells CNN he knows he's behind, but he's still optimistic.
Now, one of the disadvantages we have, as you know, is under New York state law. Independents cannot participate in the Democratic primary. We usually win the independent vote 2-1. So we're kind of spotting Secretary Clinton a whole lot in that regard. But if the voter turnout is high, if working people come out to vote, if young people come out to vote, we can win this thing.
Clinton is battling Sanders, but couldn't turn down an opportunity to swipe at Republicans Donald Trump and Ted Cruz.
And I can tell you this, I will not let someone like Donald Trump or Ted Cruz say what he is saying about the people, the hardworking people, including immigrants, but everyone who works hard in New York.
Nearly 300 Democratic delegates and 96 Republican delegates are at stake in New York's primary tomorrow. Brazil's president is in serious political trouble, that is. The lower house of Brazil's Congress voted to impeach Dilma Rousseff, sending the measure to the Senate. Some hold this president responsible for a devastating recession, high taxes, and poor public services. She came to power promising to improve the lives of the poor. News of her impeachment sparked several celebrations in Brazil. Europe's contentious debate over the influx of refugees and migrants shows no sign of letting up. This after Pope Francis visited refugees on the Greek island of Lesbos this weekend. Jack Figel chairs the Orientale Lumen Foundation, sponsoring ecumenical conferences for lay people. Steve Oshana, the executive director of A Demand for Action. Jack, Pope Francis was joined by Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch, and Hieronymus II, the Archbishop of Athens. What does this visit do for ecumenism?
I think it shows a perfect example of how the Orthodox and Catholic churches can join together in social good for the good of the world. And it gives a perfect way for the two churches to cooperate and to learn how to dialogue together.
Pope Francis calls them brothers, and he treats them that way. Steve, your team members recently returned from Greece. What work are they doing there?
Yeah, so our founder and president, Nirikino, was in Rhodes, specifically looking for the remains of family members for people who had lost their families off the coast of the Mediterranean. We've had a lot of refugees turn up in Sweden who don't know where their remains of their families are. So there's a DNA bank that we've been helping people get into so that we can go there and identify their families' remains and give them some closure on this devastating loss.
So these people not only have no homes and don't know what their future holds, they have lost loved ones in this process.
They've lost loved ones, and they don't know, where those loved ones are, and they're looking for closure, and it has a serious psychological effect on these folks. And we feel like it's our duty to help them identify that and give them a proper burial and find some closure in this process.
In making his high-profile visit to Lesbos this weekend, the Pope made it clear this is not political, that it is humanitarian. However, he does encourage, in fact, urges Europe to be open to refugees. Do either of you see this happening?
Absolutely. Europe has, in countries like Sweden in particular, have taken a lot of refugees. What I think can come from the Pope's visit is to highlight the fact that the majority, the Christians have been very grossly underrepresented in that refugee process. And, there needs to be special attention given to the plight of Christians as they're leaving Syria and Iraq and other places.
So demands for action advocates for these Christian refugees.
Absolutely.
Specifically.
We advocate for everybody, but in particular, the Christians, Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriacs have been underrepresented in the refugee numbers.
Yeah, Jack, do you see Europe welcoming refugees as Pope urges them?
It's very difficult to tell. Some countries have come out very much for it. Some have come out against, especially the Eastern European countries. The Hungarian president a month ago raised serious objections, wanting to put up walls and so forth. So I think there's a great debate that's going on in Europe, and the Pope is weighing in on the side of the refugees, which is, I think, encouraging because that's what the gospel of Jesus Christ preaches.
All right, Jack Figel, Steve Oshana, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, a professor of social science discusses same-sex parenting. And the case of the Little Sisters of the Poor unites people behind religious freedom. Thank you for joining us on this Monday evening, April the 18th. I'm Brian Patrick. A new study claims no differences were found between children of same-sex parents and those with a mom and a dad. The study did find that same-sex parents generally experienced more parental stress. Dr. Mark Regnerus, Associate Professor of Sociology, Skyping with us from the University of Texas at Austin. So what problems do you see with this study, Mark?
Well, if you look just at the abstract or the media, you'd see there's no problem at all. But when I dig a little deeper, it talks about the parental stress that lesbian mothers exhibit far more than opposite-sex parents. But that parental stress isn't really about stress on them. What it is it indicates that they're angrier and more irritated with their children. They find their children more difficult than other children their age.
What about your own study conducted with adults who had same-sex parents? What findings did you come up with?
Right. Well, they tended to focus on a small handful of issues. We talked to the children themselves once they were grown up. we spanned 40 different outcomes, both reflections on when they were growing up and how they're doing today. And we found that consistently, if you had a mother who had a same-sex relationship or a father who had, across the board, almost, I'd say 60+% of the time, there were negative influences when compared with kids whose mothers and fathers had been married and were still married today.
Are your peers willing to discuss your study with you and discuss this issue?
Right. It's a frosty subject. One of the frustrating things is that people felt like I sort of teed it up to deliver the kind of findings that people wanted to hear in the socially conservative community, but that was not the case at all. Even from the get-go, a lot of us got together and designed a study that was going to be really solid, but people didn't like my peers didn't like the answers. And so in the past 4 years, I've undergone no shortage of pure irritation at me.
So what motivates you in your work?
Right. In this particular case, it's a scientific question. The literature on this area had been really weak, and we wanted to do a large data collection project, random sampling, a lot of outcomes, and a key thing is to talk to kids after they've left the household so they can reflect on it. And if parents are answering for kids, you're not going to be surprised when it sounds like there's no differences.
Dr. Mark Regnerus, thanks for joining us from the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you, Brian.
The Little Sisters of the Poor and other religious employers await a Supreme Court ruling on their challenge to the HHS mandate. It requires contraceptives and abortion-inducing drugs to be included in health care plans for their employees. A new poll gives a picture of what Americans think of this case. Andrew Walther is Vice President of Communications and Strategic Planning for the Knights of Columbus. What does the poll find?
Well, the poll finds that Americans don't agree with the government on this. They think the government is being unfair to the Little Sisters of the Poor, and the spread is quite wide. It's about 20 points. So the majority of Americans really have misgivings about this.
That is a significant margin. We should point out that the Marist poll was sponsored by the Knights of Columbus. Do you think people really understand what's the issue here?
I think that, well, I'll say it took some real doing to get the wording of this correct, because you have a situation where if the Little Sisters sign a form, the exact opposite of what they intend will occur. And so on the one hand, they're saying we don't want to do this. On the other hand, that then triggers that happening. So trying to explain this in a polling question to people who haven't thought a lot about this was a little bit daunting. But I think we got it. We worked with the attorneys to get it right. And what came back was Americans don't think this is fair, especially when you consider all of the variables in this case and all of the other ways, as the new briefs point out, that this could be done without involving the Little Sisters.
Yeah, that unusual move by the High Court asking for new briefs from both sides, that has to be encouraging.
Well, I think that most people have read it as encouraging. I think that you've seen legal scholars saying this is rather unprecedented. We're not sure, what they're looking for, but I think in the new briefs that have been filed on behalf of the Little Sisters, there is very clearly a reasonable way forward that really the government ought to accept.
And a quick reaction from Supreme Knight Carl Anderson. What did he say?
Well, in looking at the polling numbers, I think he was struck, as we all were, by the fact that it's obvious to the American people that this is unfair. This is an unfair burden on the conscience of the Little Sisters and other religious employers. There's no reason that the government can't find another way to do this. And I think that we all see now that there really is a way forward, and that what's occurring here should frankly stop.
Andrew Walther with the Knights of Columbus, thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate the support of the Knights. We appreciate you watching. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick, and we close tonight with a celebration of Sunday's World Day of Prayer for Vocations. Pope Francis ordaining 11 men to the priesthood in St. Peter's, reminding them they are chosen. He told them, "The Lord has called you one by one."